Why does the promise of eternal paradise so often pave the path to a very real hell on earth? How could a faith built on a foundation of love for one's neighbor become the perfect excuse to slaughter that same neighbor, his wife, and his children? This isn't a riddle, it's the blood-soaked balance sheet of history. In the year 1095, a man in a flowing robe stood before a crowd of shivering knights in a field in Clermont, France. He was Pope Urban II, and he was about to unleash a storm that would rage for centuries. His words were fire. He spoke of a holy city, Jerusalem, groaning under the heel of the infidel. He spoke of sacred ground desecrated. But then came the hook, the irresistible offer that turned soldiers into saints and murder into a holy act. Fight for God, he promised, and all your sins, every theft, every lie, every life you had taken would be washed clean. It was a spiritual get-out-of-jail-free card, a divine license to kill. The crowd roared a single chilling phrase, Deus vult, God wills it, and with that, the world changed. The armies went to die for the paradise their priests promised, and they built a hell on earth that no prophet had ever described. The first to answer the call were not the knights in shining armor. They were the poor, the dispossessed, a great chaotic river of humanity led by a man called Peter the Hermit. They called it a pilgrimage, but it was an armed mob. They had no supplies, no discipline, only a burning, feverish certainty. And a hungry stomach is a poor counselor in matters of faith. As they marched across Europe, they needed to eat. Their path was marked by pogroms. Jewish communities in the Rhineland who had done them no harm were the first to feel the Crusaders' piety. They were given a simple choice, baptism or death. Thousands were slaughtered. It was a dress rehearsal for the main event, a brutal lesson in how quickly a holy quest can curdle into a rampage of greed and slaughter. Could you remain human while atrocities are committed in the name of God? This ragged army was eventually annihilated in Anatolia, but they had shown the way. They had proven that the cross was not just a symbol of salvation, but also a terrifyingly effective weapon. The real armies, the professional killers, were already on their way. These were the Iron Men, the lords and knights of Europe, encased in steel and ambition, men like Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, Raymond of Toulouse. They were pious, yes, but they were also hungry for land, for glory, for plunder. They were the sharp end of the papal spear. Their journey was one of calculated brutality. They laid siege to the great city of Nicaea, and when it fell, they saw its Byzantine Christian banners flying from the walls. Their supposed allies had cut a deal behind their backs. The first crack in the Holy Alliance appeared. The Crusaders learned a valuable lesson: trust no one, not even your fellow Christians. Their march south was a nightmare of heat, thirst, and constant skirmishes. But their greatest test came at the gates of Antioch, a city whose walls were said to be impregnable. The siege dragged on for 8 agonizing months. Starvation gnawed at the Christian camp. Men ate their horses, then their leather belts. Some resorted to cannibalism, a dark secret whispered around the campfires. The holy war had descended into a primal struggle for survival. The city fell not to valor, but to betrayal. A disgruntled captain in the city's garrison was bribed to lower a rope, and Bohemond's soldiers swarmed over the walls in the dead of night. What followed was a massacre. The streets ran with blood as the Crusaders, maddened by hunger and rage, slaughtered the city's Muslim and Christian inhabitants alike. But their victory was short-lived. A massive Muslim army arrived and besieged the besiegers. Now the Crusaders were trapped inside a city stripped of food, their own private hell. It was here that faith took a bizarre, desperate turn. A peasant monk named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have had a vision. Saint Andrew had shown him the location of the Holy Lance, the very spear that had pierced Christ's side. After a day of frantic digging in a cathedral, they found a piece of sharpened iron. Was it a miracle or a hoax? It didn't matter, it was hope. Fired with a new, wild energy, the starving Crusaders marched out of the city and smashed the larger, better-fed Muslim army. It was a victory against all odds, a testament to the power of belief, however questionable its source. From Antioch, the path to Jerusalem was clear. The remaining Crusader force, a fraction of what had set out from Europe, arrived before its walls in the summer of 1099. The city was prepared. The defenders poisoned the wells outside the walls, forcing the attackers to haul water from miles away under the blazing sun. The first assaults failed. For weeks the Crusaders stared at the walls that held their ultimate prize, their frustration mounting. They built siege towers. Monstrous wooden beasts rolled slowly toward the ramparts. On the 15th of July, after a final, desperate push, Godfrey of Bouillon's men breached the walls. The dam of military discipline broke, and a flood of pent-up rage and religious frenzy poured into the holy city. The slaughter that followed shocked even the chroniclers of that brutal age. They killed everyone: Muslims and Jews, men, women, and children. They were butchered in the streets, in their homes, in their mosques and synagogues. One witness wrote that the blood in the streets was ankle-deep. The soldiers who had marched for 3 years to liberate the tomb of the Prince of Peace waded through a river of human gore. They had taken Jerusalem. They had created their kingdom, a fragile outpost of Christendom built on a mountain of skulls. But the victory felt hollow, tainted by the sheer scale of its barbarity. The Holy War had reached its climax, but it had also revealed its terrible, paradoxical heart. To save a sacred city, they had to utterly destroy it. The Crusaders believed they had cleansed the world of God's enemies, securing a beachhead for the one true faith. They had no idea the most vicious holy war would be fought not against the Saracen, but against their own Christian neighbors in the flowering fields of southern France. Was this pious carnage a betrayal of their faith, or its truest, most brutal expression? Tell us in the comments if you believe these men were brutal saints or ambitious sinners. We're dying to know. The fertile lands of Languedoc in southern France were a world away from the dust and blood of the Holy Land. In the early 13th century, this was one of the most prosperous and cultured regions in Europe. The troubadours sang of courtly love, and trade with the Mediterranean world filled the coffers of its cities, Toulouse, Albi, Carcassonne. But this land of poetry and commerce harbored a secret, a belief that the mighty church in Rome considered a cancer. They were the Cathars, the pure ones. They believed the material world, everything you could see and touch, was the creation of an evil god, a prison for the soul. They lived simple, ascetic lives. They rejected the sacraments of the Church, the authority of its corrupt priests, and the very symbol of the cross, which they saw as an instrument of torture, not salvation. To Pope Innocent III, this was more than heresy. It was a rebellion, a spiritual disease that threatened to infect all of Christendom, and diseases in the mind of the medieval Church had to be cauterized with fire. It was a perfect storm of piety and greed, and it was about to break over the sun-drenched hills of Languedoc. The spark that lit the pyre was, as is so often the case, a single murder. In the year 1208, a papal legate named Pierre de Castelnau was sent to confront the Count of Toulouse, Raymond VI, for his perceived tolerance of the heretics. The meeting went poorly. The next morning, as the legate prepared to cross the Rhône River, he was struck down by a knight in the Count's service. The Pope had his martyr. He had his justification. He declared a crusade, but this time the enemy wasn't a distant Saracen. It was a fellow Christian. He offered the same spiritual rewards as the Crusades to the east, the forgiveness of sins. But he added a new, far more tangible incentive, the lands and property of the defeated heretics. Suddenly the pious barons of northern France, men who coveted the rich territories of the south, found their faith. An army gathered, led by the ruthless and fanatically devout Simon de Montfort. The Albigensian Crusade had begun. It was not a war of liberation, it was a war of conquest disguised as an act of faith It would prove that nothing is more terrifying than a man who believes he is doing God's work. In the summer of 1209, the crusading army arrived at the gates of Béziers, a thriving city where Cathars and Catholics had lived side by side for generations. The Crusaders demanded that the city hand over its 222 known heretics. The city's leaders refused to condemn their own neighbors, so the army prepared for a long siege, but the siege never happened. A group of poorly armed citizens foolishly sortied from the gates, and the Crusaders poured through the opening. The city was taken in a matter of hours. The commander of the Crusader forces, the papal legate Arnaud Amaury, was asked by a soldier how they should distinguish the heretics from the faithful Catholics inside. His alleged reply has echoed through the darkest corridors of history. Cedait eos, novit enim dominus, qui sunt eius. Kill them all. The Lord will know his own. Whether he actually said these exact words is debated by historians. But what is not debated is what happened next. The army went berserk. They slaughtered every man, woman, and child they could find. They dragged people from the churches where they had sought sanctuary and cut their throats at the altar. 7,000 people died in the church of St. Mary Magdalene alone. By the end of the day, the city of Béziers, with its 20,000 inhabitants, had ceased to exist. It was a smoking, blood-soaked ruin. The terror had begun. The massacre at Béziers worked exactly as intended. It was a calculated act of psychological warfare. City after city capitulated without a fight, terrified of suffering the same fate. Simon de Montfort carved out a personal empire from the conquered lands, becoming the new Viscount of Carcassonne and Béziers. The war became a brutal grind of sieges, scorched earth tactics, and public burnings. The Cathars and their protectors were driven into the hills, their fortified castles becoming symbols of a desperate, doomed resistance. What would you do if your faith demanded that you kill your neighbor? For the Crusaders, the answer was simple. The war was no longer about converting heretics, it was about exterminating them. The chivalry and courtly love of the troubadours were replaced by the screams of the tortured and the stench of burning flesh. The conflict was a masterclass in how religious zeal can be used as a tool for political and economic expansion, a land grab sanctified by the Church. The armies marching under the banner of Christ were not saving souls, they were seizing assets. It was a brutal reminder that a holy war is often the most unholy of all. The final act of the tragedy took place at the castle of Montségur, a jagged fortress perched on a formidable rock peak in the Pyrenees. For 10 months, this last bastion of the Cathar faith held out against a besieging royal army. Inside were the perfects, the spiritual elite of the Cathar faith, and the soldiers and refugees who had sworn to protect them. In March of 1244, the fortress finally surrendered. The defenders were given a choice: renounce their faith or be burned alive. Over 200 Cathars, men and women, refused to abjure. They walked calmly down the mountain to a field where a great pyre had been built. They did not weep or beg for mercy. They walked into the flames, singing, convinced that by shedding their worldly bodies, they were liberating the pure spirits within. With the fall of Montségur, the Cathar faith was essentially broken, its followers scattered, its culture erased. To ensure the heresy would never rise again, the Church perfected a new weapon, an institution of terrifying efficiency, the Holy Inquisition. This network of spies, interrogators, and torturers would hunt down the last vestiges of dissent for decades to come, creating a climate of fear that poisoned the very soul of the region. The war for the soul of southern France was over, but on the Iberian Peninsula to the south, another far longer war of the faith, a conflict that had been raging for nearly 500 years, was approaching its own bloody climax. For 7 centuries, the Iberian Peninsula was a battleground. It was a place where the crescent and the cross clashed in a relentless, brutal struggle for dominance. This was the Reconquista, the Reconquest, the longest war in European history. It began in the year 711 when a Muslim army from North Africa crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and, in a breathtakingly swift campaign, conquered almost the entire Visigothic kingdom. Christian rule was reduced to a few slivers of mountainous territory in the far north. From these tiny pockets of resistance, like the Kingdom of Asturias, the long, slow, and incredibly violent process of pushing back began. For generations, war was simply a fact of life. It was not a single, continuous conflict, but a centuries-long series of raids, skirmishes, sieges, and pitched battles, punctuated by periods of uneasy truce and even bizarre alliances. Christian and Muslim princes would sometimes team up against their own co-religionists for political advantage. It was a dirty, complicated affair where faith was the banner, but land, power, and gold were the real prizes. The frontier, the frontera, was a wild, violent place that shaped the Spanish character, forging a warrior culture that saw God as a supreme military commander. The war was a slow, grinding advance. A town would be captured, its mosque converted into a church, its Muslim population either expelled, killed, or forced to live under Christian rule. Then the line would be pushed a few miles further south. Progress was measured in decades, not years. The driving force behind this relentless push was a potent cocktail of religious fervor and land hunger. The Church framed the conflict as a holy crusade, a sacred duty to reclaim Christian lands from the infidel. Military orders, like the Knights of Santiago and Calatrava, were formed, monks in armor who took vows of poverty, chastity, and a third, more unusual vow, to kill Muslims. These orders became elite fighting forces, the vanguard of the Reconquista, rewarded with vast tracts of conquered land. The warrior saint, Santiago Matamoros, St. James the Moorslayer, became the patron saint of Spain, a celestial figure who was said to appear on battlefields, sword in hand, to lead Christian armies to victory. The very identity of the emerging Spanish kingdoms became inseparable from this holy war. To be Spanish was to be a soldier of Christ. The turning point came on a hot July day in the year 1212. A massive coalition of Christian armies from Castile, Aragon, and Navarre, bolstered by crusaders from across the Pyrenees, met the forces of the Almohad Caliphate at a place called Las Navas de Tolosa. The fate of the peninsula hung in the balance. The Christian army was outnumbered, but their desperate charge broke the Almohad lines. It was a shattering victory. The Muslim power in Spain was broken, never to fully recover. The battle opened the floodgates. In the decades that followed, Christian armies swept south, capturing major cities like Córdoba, the former heart of the Caliphate, and Seville. By the middle of the 13th century, only one Muslim state remained on the Iberian Peninsula, the Emirate of Granada, a small but wealthy kingdom nestled in the mountains of the south. For the next 2.5 centuries, Granada survived as a vassal state, paying tribute to the Christian kings of Castile, a final, glittering remnant of a lost Islamic empire. But its time was running out. The end came with the union of two formidable monarchs, Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon. The Catholic monarchs, as the Pope would later name them, were determined to complete the Reconquista and forge a united, purely Catholic Spain. In 1482, they launched the final war against Granada. It was a 10-year slog, a brutal campaign of attrition. The Spanish had adopted new gunpowder weapons, cannons that could systematically pulverize the walls of Moorish castles. Town by town, the emirate was dismembered. The final act was the long and bitter siege of the city of Granada itself, culminating in its surrender in January of 1492. After 781 years, the last Muslim banner on Iberian soil was lowered. The Reconquista was over. The victory celebrations were ecstatic, but they gave way to a dark and intolerant new chapter. The dream of a unified Catholic Spain had no room for diversity. Later that same year, the monarchs issued the Alhambra decree, ordering all Jews in Spain to either convert to Christianity or leave the country. A decade later, the Muslims were given the same ultimatum. The Inquisition, which had been perfected in the fires of Languedoc, was unleashed with full force to hunt down false converts. Spain had been reconquered, but it had lost something in the process. It had become a nation defined by religious purity, forged in the crucible of a holy war that had lasted for 30 generations. This idea of a righteous, popular war for faith was not unique to Spain. Far to the east, in the heart of Bohemia, a similar fire was about to be lit, not by a king, but by the execution of a single, defiant priest. Is a war to defend your homeland different from a war to conquer someone else's? Let us know if you stand with the resistance or the crusade. Your opinion matters, even after all these centuries. What happens when a man with a conscience goes up against an empire with a doctrine? In the early 15th century, the Kingdom of Bohemia was a powder keg of social, political, and religious tensions. The fuse was a preacher and scholar from Prague named Jan Hus. He thundered from the pulpit against the corruption of the church, the selling of indulgences, the immense wealth of the clergy, the moral failings of the popes. He argued that the Bible, not the church hierarchy, was the ultimate authority. For the powers in Rome and for the Holy Roman Emperor, Sigismund, this was dangerous talk. Hus was summoned to the Council of Constance under a promise of safe conduct from the emperor himself. It was a trap. Hus refused to recant his beliefs, arguing that he could not renounce what he had never taught and could not betray his conscience. In July of 1415, he was declared a heretic and burned at the stake. His last words were reportedly a prayer for his enemies. The men who condemned him thought they were extinguishing a fire. Instead, they had thrown a torch into the powder keg. The news of Hus's execution sent a shockwave of fury across Bohemia. To the Czechs, he was not a heretic. He was a martyr and a national hero. The simmering resentment against the power of the German-dominated church and nobility exploded into open rebellion. In 1419, a radical Hussite preacher led a procession through the streets of Prague. At the new town hall, someone threw a stone at them from a window. The enraged mob stormed the building, seized the Catholic city councillors, and threw them from the windows onto the spears of the crowd below. This defenestration of Prague was the point of no return. The Hussite revolution had begun. The movement quickly split into factions. The more moderate Utraquists sought reform within the church, while the radical Taborites rejected almost all church doctrine and sought to build a new society, a classless commonwealth of God's warriors, on earth. They gathered at a fortified hilltop they named Mount Tabor and prepared for the apocalypse. They were a bizarre and terrifying force, a commune of religious fanatics who believed they were the instruments of God's vengeance. The Pope and the Emperor responded as they always did to heresy, with a crusade. The first of 5 crusades was launched against Bohemia in 1420. A massive army of German knights and mercenaries, the Iron Fist of Christendom, marched on Prague. Against them stood an army of peasants, artisans, and lesser nobles, armed with little more than farm implements and religious fury. They should have been annihilated. But the Hussites had a secret weapon. His name was Jan Žižka. Žižka, a one-eyed, battle-scarred veteran, was a military genius of the highest order. He knew his peasant army could never stand toe-to-toe with heavily armored knights in an open field. So he rewrote the rules of warfare. He took an ordinary farm wagon and turned it into a mobile fortress. He armored its sides, cut firing slits for crossbowmen and early hand cannons, and chained them together in defensive formations called a Wagenburg, or wagon fort. When the Crusader cavalry charged, they did not find a line of terrified peasants. They found a wall of wood and iron bristling with projectiles. The charge would break against the wagons, and then Žižka would unleash his flail-wielding infantry from the gaps to slaughter the disorganized and terrified knights. It was a tactical revolution. Time and again, the crusading armies, the best soldiers in Europe, were humiliatingly defeated by Žižka's innovative tactics and the unwavering fanaticism of his troops. 5 separate crusades were sent against Bohemia, and all 5 were driven back in blood and ruin. Žižka, who eventually lost his other eye in a siege but continued to command from a wagon, became a figure of legend, an invincible blind general who could not be defeated. His Taborite armies became the terror of Central Europe, launching their own beautiful rides deep into Germany, plundering and burning monasteries and towns. They were no longer defending their homeland, they were taking the war to the enemy. The war for faith had given birth to a formidable and terrifyingly effective military machine. A state of peasants had successfully defied the combined might of the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire for over a decade. But the Hussites' greatest enemy was not the Crusaders at their gates, it was themselves. The radicalism of the Taborites and their brutal raids alienated the more moderate Hussite factions. The fire that Jan Hus had unintentionally lit was ultimately extinguished not by foreign invaders, but by his own followers. The internal divisions within the Hussite movement finally erupted into open civil war. In May of 1434, at the Battle of Lipany, the army of the moderate Utraquists, allied with Catholic loyalists, faced the radical Taborites. It was a brutal, fratricidal clash. The moderates used the Taborites' own wagon-fort tactics against them, feigning a retreat to lure them out from behind their defenses and then crushing them. The battle was a catastrophe for the radicals. Their army was annihilated, their power broken forever. With the radical wing eliminated, the moderate Hussites were able to negotiate a peace with the Church, gaining some religious concessions and ending the long and bloody wars. Bohemia was left shattered but had successfully preserved its religious identity. The Hussite wars were a stunning testament to how religious fervor, combined with military innovation, could allow a small nation to defy empires. But they also served as a dark prelude to an even greater European conflagration, a conflict where the lines between Catholic and Protestant would be drawn across the entire continent, plunging it into a century of bloodshed and ultimately into a war so devastating it would be remembered simply as the 30 Years' War. When Europe lost its mind, it did so with a prayer on its lips and a sword in its hand. The 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648 was the bloody, brutal culmination of the religious divisions that had torn the continent apart since the Reformation. It began, like the Hussite Wars, with a defenestration in Prague. Protestant nobles, fearing for their religious freedoms under the devoutly Catholic Habsburg Emperor, threw 2 imperial governors from a castle window. They survived, landing in a pile of manure, but the act was an unambiguous declaration of rebellion. What started as a localized religious dispute in Bohemia quickly spiraled into the most destructive conflict in European history until the World Wars. It was a dizzying, chaotic vortex of violence that sucked in every major power on the continent. Soon, the initial religious pretexts were all but forgotten, replaced by the cold, hard calculus of dynastic ambition and state survival. It became a war of Catholics fighting Catholics and Protestants bankrolled by Catholic cardinals. God may have been invoked in every sermon and on every battle banner, but the devil was in the details of the diplomacy. This was a new kind of war, fought not by feudal levies but by massive mercenary armies who owed allegiance only to their paymaster. Men like Albrecht von Wallenstein raised private armies of 50,000 men, living off the land they occupied. His philosophy was simple: the war must feed the war. Armies became vast, mobile states of predators, crawling across the German lands, consuming everything in their path. For the civilian population, it was an apocalypse. It didn't matter which side a soldier fought for, they were all equally rapacious. When an army passed through, it brought looting, rape, and murder. What it left behind was famine and plague. Entire regions were depopulated. Eyewitness accounts speak of a land of ghosts, of villages where the only living things were starving dogs, of fields littered with unburied bones. Stories of cannibalism became commonplace, a horrifying testament to the complete breakdown of civilization. Could you hold on to your humanity in a world gone mad? For millions, the answer was no. The war that began over theological doctrines had devolved into a primal struggle for a crust of bread. Into this maelstrom stepped two of the era's great titans. The first was Gustavus Adolphus, the King of Sweden. A devout Lutheran, he entered the war proclaiming himself the champion of the Protestant cause. But he was also a military revolutionary. His Swedish army was a disciplined professional force that stunned its opponents with innovative tactics, combining mobile artillery with disciplined infantry volleys. The Lion of the North swept through Germany, winning a series of spectacular victories. His greatest opponent was not a general, but a politician in clerical robes, Cardinal Richelieu, the chief minister of France. Richelieu was a prince of the Catholic Church, but his true religion was the French state. He saw the war as a golden opportunity to break the power of his great rivals, the Catholic Habsburgs of Spain and Austria. So, in a masterstroke of cynical realpolitik, Catholic France began to secretly fund the Protestant armies of Sweden. Faith had officially become a pawn in the great game of European power politics. It was no longer a war about salvation, but about the balance of power. The idea of a holy war had become a transparently hollow joke. The single event that came to symbolize the unparalleled horror of the war was the sack of Magdeburg in 1631. The Protestant city was besieged by the Catholic imperial army. When it finally fell, the soldiers, unpaid and undisciplined, were let loose. For 3 days, they subjected the city to an orgy of violence. They tortured, raped, and killed indiscriminately. They set fires that consumed the city, creating a firestorm that incinerated those hiding in their cellars. Of the city's 30,000 inhabitants, only 5,000 survived, mostly by hiding in the cathedral. The destruction was so total that the term Magdeburg Quarter entered the German language as a synonym for total annihilation. The commander of the imperial forces, Count Tilly, wrote that, "Since the destruction of Jerusalem and Troy, such a victory has not been seen." He meant it as a boast. It reads as the epitaph of a continent that had lost its soul. The armies of the 30 Years' War perfected a kind of total warfare that would not be seen again for centuries. Their cruelty was not an unfortunate byproduct of the conflict. It was a fundamental part of their operational strategy. After 3 decades of unrelenting slaughter, Europe was exhausted. The German lands, the main battlefield of the war, had been catastrophically ravaged. Some areas lost over half their population. The continent had bled itself white for reasons nobody could clearly remember. In 1648, the exhausted belligerents finally signed the Peace of Westphalia. This series of treaties was a landmark in world history. It didn't just end the war, it fundamentally reshaped the political map of Europe. It established the principle of state sovereignty, the idea that each nation's state has exclusive control over its own territory and domestic affairs, free from outside interference, including from the Church. It was the birth of the modern international system. In essence, the leaders of Europe, sickened by the carnage unleashed by religious fervor, agreed to take God out of the equation. States, not churches, would now be the primary actors on the world stage. They had built a new world order on a foundation of 30 million corpses. While Europe was busy tearing itself apart, a similar conflict, a clash of a rising Hindu power against a declining Muslim empire, was setting the Indian subcontinent ablaze. The story of India in the 17th century is the story of two titans locked in a death struggle. On one side was the Mughal Empire, a vast, powerful Islamic dynasty that controlled most of the subcontinent. At its helm was the emperor Aurangzeb, a man of Spartan personal habits and ruthless ambition. He was also a religious purist, a stark contrast to his more tolerant predecessors. Aurangzeb saw it as his sacred duty to impose a strict form of Sunni Islam on his overwhelmingly Hindu subjects. He destroyed magnificent Hindu temples, replacing them with mosques. He reimposed the jizya, a hated poll tax on non-Muslims. His actions were not just those of a devout ruler. They were a calculated assertion of Islamic supremacy, and they lit a fire of resentment that would ultimately consume his empire. For an emperor to rule, he must be seen as just by all his subjects, not just those who share his faith. Aurangzeb forgot this lesson, and he paid for it with his dynasty's future. The resistance to his iron-fisted rule found its champion in a man who would become a legend. His name was Shivaji Bhonsle. He was the son of a minor Maratha chieftain from the rugged Western Ghats, the mountainous spine of Western India. Shivaji was a charismatic and brilliant military leader, a devout Hindu who saw himself as the protector of his faith and people against Mughal tyranny. He started with nothing, a guerrilla leader operating from remote hill forts. But he possessed a genius for unconventional warfare. His small, highly mobile bands of Maratha horsemen would conduct lightning raids deep into Mughal territory, striking wealthy trading posts and disappearing back into the mountains before the slow, cumbersome imperial armies could react. He was a master of psychological warfare, of daring escapes and audacious attacks. In one famous incident, he agreed to meet the powerful Mughal general Afzal Khan for a parley. Fearing a trap, Shivaji wore chainmail under his clothes and concealed a wag nak, or tiger claws, a vicious set of metal claws in his hand. When the much larger Khan tried to stab him, Shivaji disemboweled the general with the hidden weapon. It was a shocking, brutal act that cemented his reputation as a cunning and fearless adversary. The conflict between Shivaji's nascent Maratha confederacy and Aurangzeb's empire was a classic clash of asymmetric forces. The Mughals had vast resources, immense armies with heavy cavalry and artillery. They were the established superpower. The Marathas had speed, local knowledge, and an unshakable belief in their cause, a concept they called Hindavi Swarajya, or self-rule for Hindus. Shivaji built a network of nearly 300 forts, using them as bases for his guerrilla campaigns. He also built a navy, challenging Mughal control of the sea lanes. He crowned himself Chhatrapati, or sovereign monarch, in a grand ceremony that consciously revived ancient Hindu traditions, directly challenging the legitimacy of Mughal rule. For Aurangzeb, Shivaji was more than a nuisance. He was a mortal threat, a mountain rat who was gnawing at the foundations of the empire. The emperor spent the last 26 years of his life in the Deccan, the southern plateau of India, in a frustrating and ruinously expensive campaign to crush the Marathas. He never succeeded. Aurangzeb died in 1707, a bitter and exhausted old man. His long, obsessive war had drained the imperial treasury and weakened the Mughal army, leaving the empire vulnerable. After his death, the Mughal Empire began a long, slow process of decline. The Marathas, however, exploded out of their mountain strongholds. Under a series of brilliant hereditary prime ministers known as the Peshwas, Maratha cavalry became the terror of India. Their armies swept across the subcontinent, from their base in Pune to the gates of Delhi, the Mughal capital. They replaced the Mughals as the dominant power in India, creating a vast but loose confederacy of Maratha states. The religious revival sparked by Shivaji had transformed into a potent political and military force. It was a stunning reversal of fortunes, a testament to how a people united by faith and a charismatic leader could topple a seemingly invincible empire. The Maratha Imperium would last for over a century, its power eventually broken not by another Indian rival, but by the disciplined armies and cunning diplomacy of the British East India Company. Half a world away, another religious vision, this one, born in the mind of a failed Chinese scholar, was about to unleash a conflict of even more staggering proportions, a holy war that would kill more people than the entire 30 Years' War. Imagine a man who fails his civil service exams 3 times. He falls into a feverish delirium and has a vision. In this dream, he is taken to a heavenly palace where a golden-bearded old man gives him a sword and tells him to slay the demons infesting the earth. He also meets an older brother who instructs him in the art of demon slaying. Years later, the man, Hong Xiuquan, reads a Christian pamphlet and has a stunning revelation. The old man in his dream was God the Father. The older brother was Jesus Christ, and he, Hong Xiuquan, was God's second son, sent to earth to establish a new kingdom. What would you do with such knowledge? Would you seek help, or would you start a revolution? Hong chose revolution, and his choice would lead to the deaths of at least 20 million people in one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history, the Taiping Rebellion. It was a war born from a bizarre fusion of garbled Christianity, Chinese peasant mysticism, and profound social discontent. China in the mid-19th century was a nation in crisis. The ruling Qing dynasty, seen as foreign Manchu overlords by many Han Chinese, was corrupt and weak. It had been humiliated by the British in the First Opium War. The economy was in shambles and peasants were starving. It was a fertile ground for radical ideas. Hong's new religion, the God-worshipping society, offered a powerful message. It was a vision of equality, of shared property, of a world free from the corrupt Manchu demons. It also promised salvation. For the downtrodden and hopeless, it was an electrifying call to arms. Hong and his followers began a campaign of iconoclasm, destroying Confucian and Buddhist idols. In 1851, they declared the establishment of the Taiping Tianguo, the heavenly kingdom of great peace, with Hong as its heavenly king. This was not a protest. It was a declaration of total war against the Qing dynasty. The rebellion spread like wildfire, attracting millions of followers. In 1853, the Taiping armies, known for their long hair and fanatical discipline, captured the great southern city of Nanjing and made it their capital, renaming it Tianzheng, the heavenly capital. The heavenly kingdom was one of history's most radical and brutal experiments in theocratic totalitarianism. Society was reorganized into military units. All property was held in a common treasury. The sexes were strictly segregated, even married couples being forced to live apart. Foot binding, opium, and alcohol were banned on pain of death. A new, simplified version of the Chinese script was introduced. At its core was the absolute authority of Hong Xiuquan, whose pronouncements were treated as divine law. But as the kingdom grew, the utopian vision began to crack. The leadership, once united by their messianic zeal, descended into paranoia and vicious infighting. In 1856, Hong, fearing a rival, orchestrated a horrific purge that killed thousands of his own followers, including some of his most brilliant generals. The heavenly kingdom began to devour itself from within. The initial promise of a just and peaceful society had given way to a reign of terror and incompetence. Utopias built by force have a fatal flaw. They require monsters to maintain them, and monsters eventually turn on each other. The war between the Taiping and the Qing was a conflict of apocalyptic scale and unimaginable brutality. For 15 years, the heartland of China was a battlefield. Both sides operated on a scorched earth policy. Cities that resisted were razed to the ground, their populations massacred. The war was not fought by professional armies alone. It was a war of all against all, with civilian militias, bandits, and secret societies joining the fray. The conflict created a demographic catastrophe. Millions died in battle, but millions more perished from the famine and disease that followed in the war's wake. Rivers were clogged with corpses. The fertile Yangtze River Valley, one of the most prosperous regions on Earth, was turned into a desolate wasteland. It was a total war in which the distinction between combatant and civilian had ceased to exist. In its sheer, mind-numbing scale of death, the Taiping Rebellion has few rivals in human history. It was a stark lesson in how a distorted religious ideology, when mixed with social desperation, can create a perfect storm of human misery. The end of the heavenly kingdom was as bloody as its beginning. The Qing, aided by Western military advisors and a new, more effective regional army, slowly began to turn the tide. They methodically encircled Nanjing. By the summer of 1864, the heavenly capital was besieged and starving. Hong Xiuquan, increasingly erratic and detached from reality, refused to believe defeat was possible. He committed suicide by poison. A few weeks later, the Qing forces breached the city walls. The slaughter that followed was immense. The Qing soldiers killed with a vengeance, eager to wipe out the last traces of the rebellion that had almost destroyed the dynasty. The heavenly kingdom of Great Peace collapsed in a final spasm of fire and blood. The rebellion was over, but it left China shattered and traumatized, its social fabric torn to shreds. The dream of a heavenly kingdom had created a living hell. While this catastrophic war raged in the East, another, colder, more methodical kind of holy war was being prosecuted in the forests of northern Europe, a war of conquest and conversion that had been grinding on for centuries. How do you erase a people? You don't just kill them, you kill their gods. In the cold, dark forests of the Baltic coast, a different kind of crusade unfolded. This was not a war to reclaim holy lands, but to conquer new ones and forcibly baptize their pagan inhabitants. The Northern Crusades of the 12th and 13th centuries were a brutal, methodical campaign of colonization and religious conversion waged by German and Danish knightly orders against the peoples of the Eastern Baltic, the Prussians, the Livonians, the Estonians. The Pope in Rome offered the same spiritual rewards as the Crusades to Jerusalem, but the real motives were, as always, more earthly: land, trade routes, and the creation of new Christian states on the northern frontier of Europe. This was not a clash of civilizations. It was the slow, deliberate crushing of one culture by another, more technologically advanced and ruthlessly organized war machine. The weapon of choice was faith, but the objective was real estate. The vanguards of this conquest were the military orders, most notably the Teutonic Knights. These were not simply soldiers, they were monk warriors who had created a terrifyingly efficient corporate state dedicated to perpetual holy war. Their strategy was systematic and brutal. They would push into pagan territory, build a stone castle as a forward operating base, and from there launch devastating raids to terrorize and subjugate the surrounding population. Their preferred tactic was the Ries, or winter raid. Using the frozen rivers as highways, armored columns of knights and their native auxiliaries would sweep deep into pagan lands, falling upon unsuspecting villages. They would burn the settlements, slaughter the men, and carry off the women and children as slaves. The goal was not just to defeat the pagan tribes in battle, but to break their will to resist, to make their way of life impossible. The cross came to the Baltic not with missionaries bearing scriptures, but with knights bearing fire and sword. It was a baptism of steel. The pagan tribes, like the Prussians and the Lithuanians, were fierce warriors, but they were politically fragmented and technologically outmatched. They fought a desperate guerrilla war in the dense forests and treacherous swamps that were their home. They would ambush crusader columns, massacre isolated garrisons, and rise up in bloody rebellions that were inevitably crushed with overwhelming force. They worshipped ancient gods of thunder and forest, and their sacred groves were the first targets of the crusaders, who would cut them down to demonstrate the impotence of the old deities. The conflict was a long and bitter struggle, a clash between the iron discipline of the knightly orders and the primal fury of the tribes. One of the most famous episodes in this long struggle was the battle on the ice in 1242, where the forces of Novgorod, led by Alexander Nevsky, defeated the Teutonic Knights on the frozen surface of Lake Peipus. While celebrated in Russia as a great victory, it was just one episode in a centuries-long contest for control of the region, a brutal frontier war with no room for mercy. Over the course of 2 centuries, the Northern Crusades succeeded in their grim task. The native Prussians were virtually exterminated as a people, their language and culture wiped from the face of the earth. The Livonians and Estonians were reduced to a class of landless serfs, ruled over by a German-speaking nobility. Lithuania held out the longest, a pagan empire in the heart of Europe, but it too eventually accepted Christianity as a political necessity to survive. The Teutonic Order created a powerful, expansionist state in Prussia that would centuries later form the nucleus of the modern German state. The Crusades had redrawn the map of northeastern Europe. They had been a spectacular success in terms of conquest and colonization, but they were a moral catastrophe, a chilling example of how the call to spread the faith can become a justification for cultural genocide. The legacy of these wars was one of deep-seated ethnic hatreds and a memory of conquest that would poison the region for centuries to come. It was a stark reminder that faith can be a tool not just for seizing land, but for erasing the entire history of its previous owners. That same dynamic, where religious identity becomes a marker for life or death, would erupt with terrifying force in the 20th century, not in a medieval forest, but in the sophisticated cosmopolitan streets of a modern city. Is it better to die for your gods or to watch them die for you? Your answer in the comments might just tell us everything. Let us know if you choose the path of the martyr or the survivor. What happens when a nation is not a place, but a fragile, intricate agreement? For a brief, glittering moment, Lebanon was that nation. It was called the Switzerland of the Middle East, a vibrant, multicultural hub of banking, tourism, and culture. Its capital, Beirut, was a playground for the international jet set, a city of stunning beauty and intellectual ferment. But beneath this glamorous surface, the foundations were rotten. Lebanese society was a precarious mosaic of 18 recognized religious sects, a complex power-sharing arrangement between Maronite Christians, Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, and the Druze. This delicate confessional system was a ticking time bomb, a legacy of colonial map-making that held together a nation with no unifying national identity beyond the shared fear of its collapse. In 1975, the bomb finally went off. The Lebanese Civil War was not a simple two-sided conflict. It was a chaotic, multi-front war of all against all, a Hobbesian nightmare where your religion determined your allegiance and your neighbor could become your executioner overnight. The trigger was the arrival of the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO. Expelled from Jordan, thousands of heavily armed Palestinian militants set up a state within a state in southern Lebanon, using it as a base to launch attacks on Israel. Their presence completely upended Lebanon's fragile demographic and political balance, empowering the country's disenfranchised Muslim population and terrifying the politically dominant Maronite Christians. The tensions erupted into open warfare in April 1975, when Christian Falangist gunmen ambushed a bus carrying Palestinians in Beirut, killing 27 people. The city exploded. Beirut was torn in two along the Green Line, a no-man's land of snipers and rubble that separated the largely Muslim West from the Christian East. The war quickly devolved into a brutal cycle of sectarian violence, kidnappings, and revenge killings. Militias, often little more than neighborhood gangs armed with Kalashnikovs, carved the country into a patchwork of warring fiefdoms. It was a war fought not for territory, but for identity. The conflict became a regional proxy war, a chessboard on which Lebanon's powerful neighbors played out their own geopolitical ambitions. Syria intervened, ostensibly to restore order, but ended up occupying the country for decades. Israel invaded twice, once to drive out the PLO, and later to create a security zone in the south. Iran backed the creation of a new, radical Shia militia, Hezbollah. The United States of America, France, and other Western powers sent in peacekeeping forces, only to be drawn into the maelstrom, culminating in the horrific 1983 bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut that killed 241 American servicemen. Every foreign intervention, no matter how well-intentioned, only added another layer of complexity and bloodshed to the conflict. Lebanon became the battlefield for everyone else's wars, its people the cannon fodder, in a game they could not control. The dream of a Middle Eastern Switzerland had become a charnel house. The darkest chapter of the war came in September of 1982. Israeli forces had surrounded the Palestinian refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila in West Beirut. They allowed their Christian Falangist militia allies to enter the camps to root out PLO fighters. What followed was not a military operation, but a 3-day orgy of slaughter. The Falangists, seeking revenge for the assassination of their leader, went from house to house, butchering unarmed civilians, men, women, and children. Israeli soldiers stood by, firing flares into the sky to illuminate the killing fields for the militiamen. Up to 3,500 people were massacred. Sabra and Shatila became a global byword for atrocity, a horrifying symbol of the war's descent into absolute depravity. The war had begun with political grievances, but it had metastasized into pure, nihilistic, sectarian hatred. Your faith was your death sentence. The sophistication of Beirut, its universities and art galleries, proved to be a thin veneer over ancient, tribal animosities that were easily reignited. The 15-year war finally sputtered to an end in 1990, but it left behind a shattered country, a traumatized population, and scars that have never fully healed. It was a chilling preview of the 21st century, demonstrating how quickly modern societies can collapse along ancient religious fault lines. But even the Lebanese civil war, for all its horror, was a localized conflict. The next stage in the evolution of holy war would have no borders, no front lines, and no clear end. It would be global. The arid mountains and dusty plains of Afghanistan have long been the graveyard of empires. In 1979, the Soviet Union became the latest foreign power to learn this lesson. Their invasion, intended to prop up a friendly communist regime, instead became a 10-year quagmire. But this war did something else. It created the perfect incubator for a new, globalized form of holy war. For the Islamic world, the Soviet invasion was a brazen act of aggression by an atheist superpower against a Muslim people. A call for jihad, or holy struggle, went out. With generous funding from the United States of America, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, all eager to see the Soviets bleed, thousands of foreign Muslim volunteers poured into Afghanistan to fight alongside the local mujahideen. They came from across the globe, from Egypt to the Philippines. One of them was a wealthy, charismatic young Saudi named Osama bin Laden. In the crucible of the Afghan war, these men were forged into a hardened cadre of international holy warriors. They learned guerrilla warfare, bomb-making, and most importantly, they forged a global network built on a shared, radical ideology. When the Soviets finally withdrew defeated in 1989, these men did not go home and put down their weapons. They took their new skills and their new global vision of jihad with them. They had defeated a superpower. They believed they could defeat another. The organization that emerged from the ashes of the Soviet-Afghan war was called Al-Qaeda, the base. Its goal was ambitious and terrifying: to unite Muslims globally to fight against the West, particularly the United States of America, which bin Laden saw as the far enemy propping up corrupt, un-Islamic regimes in the Middle East. Al-Qaeda was a new kind of enemy. It was not a state. It had no army, no territory to defend. It was a decentralized transnational network, a terrorist startup that used modern technology, satellite phones, the internet, international finance, to spread its ancient, violent ideology. The battlefield was no longer a remote country. The battlefield was the entire world. Al-Qaeda's war was a war of symbols, of spectacular acts of violence designed to terrorize and provoke. The bombings of American embassies in Africa in 1998, the attack on the USS Cole in 2000. These were just the prelude. The main event, the attack that would change the world forever, came on a clear blue morning in September of 2001. 19 hijackers turned civilian airliners into guided missiles and struck the economic and military heart of the United States. The collapse of the Twin Towers in New York City was not just an act of mass murder. It was a televised spectacle of horror, a declaration of war broadcast live across the globe. The September 11th attacks triggered a global war on terror. The United States invaded Afghanistan to topple the Taliban regime that had harbored Al-Qaeda. In 2003, it invaded Iraq, citing faulty intelligence about weapons of mass destruction and links to terrorism. While both invasions quickly toppled the enemy regimes, they also created a power vacuum, unleashing sectarian chaos and fueling a new generation of jihadists. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq became powerful recruiting tools, proof to many in the Muslim world that the West was waging a war on Islam itself. Al-Qaeda, though damaged, had succeeded in its primary goal: to drag the United States into a long, costly, and demoralizing conflict in the Muslim world. The very act of fighting the terrorists created more terrorists. The war had no clear front line and no obvious endpoint. It was a war of drone strikes and suicide bombings, of night raids and improvised explosive devices. It was a shadowy, asymmetrical conflict that pitted the world's most powerful military against a diffuse, ideologically motivated enemy who saw death as martyrdom. What do you do when your enemy doesn't fear dying, but welcomes it as a gateway to paradise? The chaos unleashed by the invasion of Iraq gave birth to an even more monstrous entity. A splinter group of Al-Qaeda, calling itself the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS, took the concept of jihad to a new, even more brutal level. Where Al-Qaeda was a clandestine network, ISIS was a proto-state. At its height, it controlled a vast territory in Iraq and Syria, an area the size of Great Britain. It had its own army, its own administration, its own currency. It declared the restoration of the Islamic Caliphate, demanding the allegiance of all Muslims worldwide. But its most terrifying innovation was its mastery of modern media. ISIS didn't just commit atrocities, it professionally produced, packaged, and broadcast them online. Beheadings, mass executions, the burning of prisoners alive, all were filmed in high definition and disseminated on social media, turning ancient barbarity into a viral spectacle. It was terror as performance art, designed to shock the West and attract legions of disaffected young recruits from around the world. The black banner of ISIS became the symbol of a new, nihilistic holy war that reveled in its own cruelty. Today, the physical caliphate of ISIS has been destroyed, and Al-Qaeda's leadership has been decimated, but the ideology that spawned them is far from dead. It has metastasized, transforming into a global movement that continues to inspire lone wolf attacks and terrorist plots from Paris to Jakarta. The internet has become the new Afghanistan, a virtual training camp where anyone with a grievance and a Wi-Fi connection can be radicalized. The ancient ideas of martyrdom and holy war have been weaponized for the digital age. The story that began with a papal promise in a field in France has come full circle. We are left with a chilling realization. Faith remains the most powerful and volatile force in human history. It can build civilizations and inspire breathtaking acts of charity, but twist it, arm it with righteous certainty, and it becomes the ultimate weapon, capable of turning ordinary men into monsters and the entire planet into a battlefield. This war has not ended, it has only changed its form, and its next chapter has yet to be written. The final war will be fought not with bombs, but for belief. As you look at the world today, what do you see as the greater threat? The chilling certainty of the fanatic or the quiet indifference of the apathetic? Let us know in the comments below.